super excited to welcome Trish Biers today. Dr. Trish Biers curates the Duckworth Collection at the Department of Archaeology at the University of Cambridge. Trish's research interests include curation and the care of human remains, osteoarchaeology, ethics and the dead, ancient disease, memento mori and catacombs, and museum studies focusing on death, body modification, and repatriation. So without further ado,
all the dead stuff.
The camera is on a weird setting.
Okay, the camera's on a weird setting. That's fine. Oh, bad. Okay.
What's a hybrid seminar without them? There we go. Good. There we go. Good.
Awesome. Hello. Thanks for having me here. I'm very happy to be here. It's good to see some familiar faces in the audience. Hi, everyone. Okay, so I'm Trish Biers. I had the privilege of working with Hannah in Cambridge, which was really lovely. She's ran out to get me some water, but she's awesome. Don't tell her. Just kidding. Tell her all the time. So I'm going to talk to you guys about what I do, basically, and management. I was just saying you're awesome because you are. Thank you. So, right. So my talk is called Body Parts and Human Hearts, and there's a reason for that. Collections management and the heritage of death in the UK. I'm assuming you already know you're probably going to see images of human remains, but I just like to do a little act of kindness to let everybody in the audience know that I am going to be doing that. And some of it is pretty sensitive, but I don't show things without a real purpose, okay? The whole ethos that I work by is every day I come to work and I look after a lot of deceased people. So I am the curator of the Duckworth. The Duckworth is a very large biological anthropology collection at the University of Cambridge. We have, and this is not to sound boastful, but essentially there's around 18,000 human remains, and they're archaeological and anatomical. I'm in your face. We also have we look after a blood and a hair and a brain collection. We care for around 400 non-human primate skeletons, 400 fossil hominin casts, and we have an archive of 300 years of collecting history. So problematic in a lot of ways, of course. Yep, it's Cambridge, it's Britain, yes. So the Duckworth is essentially an amalgamation of many collections. So in 1945, we were formed. Dr. Duckworth is there in the corner. It was named after him, who was a reader in anatomy, who was an avid collector and responsible for a lot of the remains that entered into Cambridge in the early 1900s. So the Duckworth was formed in 1945, as I said, but prior to that, there was a lot of collecting going on. So you had a museum of anatomy, you had zoology, museum of archaeology and anthropology, lots of different colleges. So this is a map that basically shows all the different people involved in collecting other people. So you can see some similar, I'm sure you know Leakey, Petrie, Carl Pearson, one of the most well-known British eugenicists. Yep, we have his whole archive. So John Thurnham, so names that you're probably pretty familiar with. Most of the human remains that we care for are British, from British archaeological excavations, although also anatomical collections. We look after around sort of 6,000 individuals from Africa, most from Egypt and Sudan. So very large collection in that respect. Lots of people come from all over the world to work in the Duckworth. And then we have individuals that we look after. Around 10% of the rest of the collection is Australia, New Zealand, all over the Pacific, the Americas, all over the world, to be honest. So it's a vast place, and I'm the only full-time person for the whole thing. So it's a lot of work, but every day I come to work, I am looking after people who've passed on, and so we do a lot of different things in the Duckworth. But something I'm really proud of is this. For a long time, the balance of research essentially happening in the collection was very much research based and repatriation here. So the scale was actually this way, sorry. So we've had, it's an open collection, people from all different countries, all different academic backgrounds come to the Duckworth to do osteoarchaeology, but it's really, we've seen a big shift. And so now we're mostly doing repatriation research now. And there's still some other osteological research going on, but it's definitely changed. And so I'm the first person that's held this post at Cambridge. It was an acknowledgement by the department that actually we really need someone in post who can manage this collection and open up the lab for more researchers, but also more discussions around return and restitution. So that's what we've been doing. So at the moment we have 5 different claims in process, or collaborations as I prefer to call them, around repatriation, because it is a collaborative effort and it's really incredible. So there's been quite a lot going on, and then we also have a lot of conversations happening right now too. So it's a really vibrant time in the Duckworth. You know, we've come from a very difficult background. Collections like the Duckworth and other institutions in the UK, people were collected in colonial regimes, imbalance of power, racist studies, archaeology in different forms. So there's no point in hiding it or pretending it didn't happen. It's sometimes, in some respects, the very embodiment really of British colonial violence. So that's just the way that it is, and that's how collections were formed in a lot of ways across Europe. So we have a lot of conversations going on now about what to happen next, which is really great. Still trying to get the university to fund a lot of that work, because I feel strongly that if an institution sent out its academics into the universe in 1902 to explore this land, and they brought all these objects and people back so that Cambridge could benefit from that, I think they actually need to also acknowledge that and put in some cash to make sure that we can actually do some of this restitution, so that we can bring people here and actually talk to them about what they would like to see happen to people who they often associate as ancestors. Not everyone uses ancestral remains. That's a really important thing to think about. But it is something that we're trying to get done. So every day I come to work, we do a lot of these different things. We have a small team, which is great now. A part-time technician, a part-time administrator, and a part-time director, although really it does take up more than just part-time. So we do a lot of your basic osteoarchaeology stuff, identification, treatment of the dead, looking at things like decoration on remains. Luckily, human remains are pretty stable, but we have environmental conditions, pest traps. I let someone else deal with that because I don't like spiders. They are huge. But the things that, I mean, I try to participate, you know, I'm pretty tough, but anyway, so we have a lot of looking at sort of old antiquated curatorial treatments, pesticides put on remains. So we deal with a lot, but we're doing a lot of other things too. We are doing analysis. The team writes papers. For a long time, people used to write on human remains like this. We don't do that anymore. I actually offer like sort of a service, if you will, to communities. So once we photograph the remains, if remains are going to be returned, I've developed a little sort of conservation cocktail that removes the ink if they'd like that or not, and they can have that done. So we try to address, you know, the objectification in certain ways as well, looking at colonial connections, trying to be really transparent with what the collection's about. I do spend a lot of time every day going like this into the sky, which is usually about a journalist, other external academics, or the, you know what I'm talking about, or, you know, dealing with sort of getting the university higher ups to really understand how important collections are, not just people, not just biological anthropology collections, but, you know, material culture as well. So trying to do that. I'm never giving up. Also, I love having students, and they're pretty dramatic sometimes. We find strange things in the collections, like weird boxes. So this was just, you know, we have a lot of student volunteers. We have a lot of students doing their research in the collection, and Repatriation isn't, I've been doing this professionally for 30 years now, which is really tripping me out a little bit, going, whoa, wait a second. But repatriation has been a part of my life for decades, and there's no real coursework on it, practical education in it. A lot of the time you have to go, maybe you might go to a short course or something, but to actually do the work, what's the practical aspect of decolonizing work? Repatriation is actually that. It's a practical aspect. It's boots on the ground. It's having the hard conversations with people. It's being present for their emotion, because a lot of times you're working with people who are feeling incredibly, angry and upset, and you have to, there's no training for that. So we do try to get the students in quite a lot to sort of assist with this work, because it is valuable. It's a valuable skill set, but one that's not necessarily taught in a practical way. So one of the things I'm really interested in is sort of the heritage of death. And so talking about the Duckworth is something I really like to do, but it's also, I'm really interested in these concepts of this type of heritage. You've heard deathscapes maybe. There's a long tradition, of museums, particularly European, collecting and displaying bodies. The corpse was often presented as a scientific specimen. In the Enlightenment, there was this whole movement about sort of this, religious rapture, looking at death in the face. So you'd be more pious, you'd be more spiritually inclined. Human remains are a really interesting actor in all of that, and I'll talk about that in a minute. Talking about vanity and mortality. Most museums that you go into, at least that have any kind of archaeological collections, or like the British Museum, for example, a lot of the stuff you're seeing, the glittering masks and the swords and the jewelry, it came from graves. So death is omnipresent to a degree in our universe, especially, here we are in Leicester. You guys have like the best museum studies program, and we've all been around probably to different museums, but a lot of those things that we're looking at, even the paintings, right, of the corpse hiding behind the flaxen-haired virgin, looking, naked, looking off into the distance, and he's creeping on her. There's death everywhere. Talking about mortality and vanity, religion. These are all things that are just, a lot of different places, but they're getting removed too, to a degree, in these institutions. And I think, if you're talking about feasting for the dead, you're talking about, trade, you're talking about agriculture, everything kind of can revolve, ritual, agriculture, socio-political ideology, religious ideology. It's really interesting, because burials, there's so much that can be involved in them. So I think they're really valuable. I think death is really valuable to talk about in a lot of different ways. You can philosophize about it too, but in archaeology and anthropology, it's so crucial to looking at things like human creativity and ingenuity and technology. So I worry sometimes when I hear about this removal of death from these landscapes, because museums in particular, this is a place for free education. Usually I've been privy to some amazing conversations between parent and child, who are talking about, they see a skeleton, and the conversation that unfolds is really powerful. It's the first time they're actually talking about what happens when you die. And you don't really get that necessarily in other arenas. I mean, maybe, obviously maybe at church or something, but so I think there's a really unique place in heritage to talk about death and death heritage. We talk a lot about, with collections like the Duckworth and others too, there was very much about, everything was exploration and classification, but it's really important that while they were collecting zebras and rhinos, they were collecting people too, and people's heads were mounted on walls right next to the rhino. That is brutal, and that's the kind of legacy that we have to deal with in our field, but that I actually have to deal with every day. And sometimes I don't do it very well. And it's hard, but that's the truth of it as well. We have to really be thinking about that, because, I hear a lot about people roll their eyes at me. I don't care. People are like, oh, you're woke. I don't care. What I care about are the people under my care, and the living. I've worked for the dead for 30 years. I started young. I've always worked with the dead. That's all I've ever done. So I've had thousands of conversations about how people feel about death, how they see it, how they view it, what should they do? I don't know. There's so much interesting stuff there because how we feel about death is deeply embedded in who we are, how we were raised, our culture, our religion. When was the first time you experienced it? Were you very young? Was it tragic? All of this shapes us, okay? So, and how people take care of the dead, treat the dead is so vastly different across centuries and regions, countries, right? It's fascinating to me. But in this exploration is where we see this classification of people and this commodification of the dead, this trade of people. One of the hats I wear is I'm the co-coordinator of this task force on the trade and sale of human remains for the British Association of Biological Anthropology and Osteoarchaeology. Boom. Babio or Babao or however you want to say it. And it's shocking to me that we're having these conversations all over again where indigenous remains are being sold to the highest bidder. And once they go into a private collection, there's no repatriation. So unless they do it out of the kindness of their heart. But what we're seeing at these times of these high peaks, so 17th, 18th century, is also this idea of corpse aversion. And this is where you really, at least in the UK, you see this sort of this divide, where people stop being people and become objects. And I think this is a really interesting thing to think about because now we're coming back around to where we're like, oh, hang on a minute. I don't use, we don't say objects for people, but lots of people do. But now we're kind of rethinking our language. We're rethinking how we address situations around human remains, what we call them, ancestral remains, human remains, biomatter, taboo. A divination skull is different from a trophy skull, is different from an ancestor head. Okay? They all have their own cultural power, and it's important to think about that. Something that really worries me is when I hear these pan-reburial conversations, and I'll talk about that in a minute, but there's so much variation and uniqueness that we really need to think about those things. And I love that these conversations are happening more and more. The dead do have a presence. They're political tools. I mean, you're in Leicester, I don't really need to say the parades of the royals and everything else. So it's a really interesting, I think, topic to discuss. And I could go on and on and on. I won't, because I know I need to keep to time, and you need to keep me to time because I get carried away. And I just want to say I had permission from the parents to take this photo. So I did a lot of my field work in Peru, and we were uncovering mummies in Lima, and we were poor kids. We took over their whole their whole playground. So this is actually a mummified person here. Right, you can see how close under the surface, and then the kids were really quite fascinated. And but I did actually put a note out to say I want to take this photo. I took this photo. Am I allowed to use it? So, but it's really interesting to think about that. So, what are the current issues that we, this is probably isn't news to any of you, but these are just the things that I think are really at the top. And repatriation and ethics. That's a big one. We are in a state in the UK where these conversations are commonplace now. When I first came here to do my PhD in 2005, hardly anyone was talking about this. I had somebody very prominent who I respected very much say NAGPRA was a mistake. NAGPRA being the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. And that's fine. People can have their own opinion, obviously. But it's so interesting to see how different the conversations are now, which is super cool. Scientific research, obviously, I think osteobiographies, I think osteoarchaeology is amazing, and I think what we can learn about people is amazing. I think there's a lot of people that don't get in the story that get back in the story through osteoarchaeology. I think that's really important. But then we also have some of these other things that we never really had decades ago, like social media, and now this super high-tech facial reconstruction where Nefertiti is going like this, and you're like, what is happening? So, and then back to the sale of human remains again, which is really quite prolific. So I work for an academic institution, as do you, so it's, similar to museums. The Duckworth is a museum collection, but it's in a department. So we don't have some of the same, like accreditation. We're not accredited like you would in a museum, but that doesn't mean we don't use the same standards and things which we do for care. Looking at who makes decisions, governing bodies, a lot of what Cambridge is about, and like any other university, is reputational risk. So talking about these other things that, you know, you don't really have a lot of training in, but you have to kind of work through, and you get there in the end, hopefully. But really, again, inheriting these really difficult legacies, and that's like a big one. So I've kind of already talked about some of this. And again, repatriation is doing the practical work. Again, I can't believe we're having, you know, raffles with human remains that we're having to try and stop. But these are some of the core things, I think, and I think a lot about unequal status. I think a lot about sacred, secret objects. I think a lot about human remains in general and how we're actually caring for them, and how institutions are desperately in need of funds and staff and rely on volunteers to get work done. And it's really incredible. And I love osteoarchaeology. I love working with human remains. And I say that, I hope you can see, in a very respectful way. It's never lost on me that these are people that, you know, had lives. And I hear a lot, oh, we need to rehumanize the skeletons. They never stopped being human. They stopped breathing. So to me, it's really important to acknowledge that they've never stopped being human. It's just, unfortunately, sometimes disciplines go a different direction, and you get these sort of, I deal with a lot of like the big biology genetics folks who have a different mindset than, say, my anthropology colleagues, right? So everyone's a sample, everyone's a person. So kind of trying to live in that middle area is really complex. And I love what osteobiographies can show, because, like, for example, social inequality, this is one that I'm particularly interested in, because we have social inequality in death care now. So you have racism in death care, you have poverty in death care. We've had that in the past too. So I think osteoarchaeology is a really great way to kind of bridge those things together, the past and the present. The same kinds of issues we're always talking about in archaeology, the elites and the non-elites. But there's a lot of common folks in the middle that don't get discussed. I mean, I did my PhD in Peru, and there were Spanish documents that said, but that's women's work, so we'll pass over it. Well, wait a second. The Inca didn't pass over it. So it's, I think, and I love, and I'm kind of on the fence about reconstructions, to be fair, but I'm obsessed with this one. Everyone that here knows me knows I'm obsessed with. I think this individual here, who I'll call the shaman from the Trelleborg Museum, is just phenomenal. You know, the way they've been able to do the DNA, to look at the DNA of her and the way she was buried, if she identifies as a her. But, you know, seated flex position on this bed of furs and antlers, and is wearing this amazing feather cape and this incredible belt of animal teeth of over 100 different species. I just think it's super amazing. But the fact that she also had this different role in society from what everyone thinks is, oh, the hunters and the gatherers. But what about the other people, the creative people, the people responsible for well-being and care? They did exist in the past too. But I just think it's really interesting what you can, you know, this direct evidence, because you have, with osteoarchaeology, you can have these whole populations, but you can also have these wonderful intimate details of someone's life. And again, we're talking about these folks in their death, you know, what happened at the moment of their death, and when they're holding little objects, or it's all very personal. And I think with osteology and human remains, you really get that side of things. I think ceramics are awesome, and I love pigment and food in the past, but I just think human remains can really give you a really interesting perspective in a big way, and a very personal way as well. So there's lots of amazing guidelines, protocols that we try to follow. This is just a handful, you know, giving us that framework, that structure. How can we be ethically minded? What do we do every day in practice, that thinking about ethics and duty of care, how we approach students, and how we have conversations with community, local and international. You know, we can't forget about our local communities. They're really important too. And some of them want repatriation as well. So how do you navigate some of that? these are great for those things, but they also sometimes don't tell you how to deal with the really hard stuff, like this is graphic, I know, but you know, sitting across from someone explaining to them that their ancestor died in a military hospital, the head was removed, and then they were bisected. And to tell that to someone and to watch their response and to say, well, when they say, well, wait, tell me again what bisected is. And then to have to tell them that their head has been cut in half. And to be present for that. It's powerful, and I have permission to share that. I won't say who it was with, but I had that conversation not that long ago. Again, I've had it twice now. And so there's no there's no guidelines for that, you know. I mean, you can take all the well-being courses you need and health and safety, but these are the conversations that people are having, and these are the things, though, that obviously aren't discussed on social media, aren't discussed in big ways. I talk about them here in these rooms, especially with early career researchers, because this is what you're inheriting, you know. But I am very honest, and you can ask me anything. But I much rather, you know, it's hard to talk about those stuff in such a way so it's easy for people to misjudge. But these are the things that I deal with on a regular basis. So I eat a lot of tacos, and I have a lot of crystals and incense, and that is totally, I'm an emotional eater, and I'm very proud of it. I don't mind. So I'm just kidding. Well, not with tacos. I love tacos. But anyway, so these are wonderful to protect you. Policies are there to protect you as staff. They're there to protect the communities that you work with and the dead. So I think they're important. But again, this is why we try to do a lot of volunteering. I mean, if I could pay all the students, my gosh, I surely would. I buy them food. But, you know, it's why we try to have these, you know, try to bring folks over and to have these conversations and to get this sort of firsthand training so that people can understand what's going on. I'm doing okay, aren't I, on time? Everybody okay? I know that was kind of a graphic story, but it's important. These are some of my favorite things to talk about too, and again, that kind of go under the radar sometimes unless you've worked. I mean, a lot of the repatriation discussions are US centric, and I acknowledge that massively. Over here, you know, like the Iron Age, what were people doing with the dead? It was so wild, and re-engagement. So these conversations don't always work. They need more nuance. There's a lot of gray area, but these are just, if you're interested in doing museum work and you want to work with communities and you want to get more involved in things like curation, and that may involve, you know, colonial legacies, return. These are some great things with, and this is something we practice in the Duckworth. So I was very fortunate to work at the Smithsonian Natural History Museum and in the repatriation osteoarchaeology laboratory. And tradition of care was something I knew about before when I was working in California, which is where I'm from. So which is, you know, making sure that we have the right tools or things in the collections like tobacco and sweetgrass. And I mean, I've got all kinds of stuff in the collection that people can use, can bring, can leave, seal skin, crystals, pollen, you know, anything that people want to leave with the people that are in our care until they can make a decision of what's going to happen next. So I think these are great articles. And the supernatural idea as well is something that's not necessarily spoken about too much. I mean, it is in certain circles, but, you know, thinking about our well-being as staff as well and what we're facing. And, you know, I've been in situations where I've gone to a collection in a different country, and they're taking me in to meet the ancestors into the collections room, and the women are out, you know, like this, fearful for me because there's a spirit in there, a very masculine spirit that's very angry. So they're worried about me. So their male colleague brings me in and introduces me. Now, when I talk about that, I'm from California, okay? I get a lot of eye rolls for a lot of things, but this is something that I get quite a bit, is like, oh, that's ridiculous, and what are they talking about? But these are serious things in a museum context. These are things that I take very seriously in my role. And if you want to work in certain situations that involve other people's ideology and spiritual practices, you know, you need to think about that as well. So Luckily, I didn't have any bad experiences with that one. But it is these are just, I think these are really lovely resources for students, especially to look at. There's a lot of debates around human remains. I'm sure you're all aware of those, especially around things like consent and, you know, we don't have their consent. We shouldn't use them, or how can you apply consent to the past? Most people were, you know, ruled by the church. They didn't have consent anyways. I've heard a lot of different debates on this, depending on where you are, obviously. That's just one little example. But, you know, some of the other ones about removing all human remains. But shouldn't local specialists be the ones to decide? Local specialists being people from that community. These pan reburial, pan return conversations. But also, you know, it's not, return isn't necessarily appropriate for everyone, and that looks different for everyone. Some people actually don't have the resources to do any of that in their country at the moment because of civil war or something else. So it's our job to kind of help support that by caring for the people they've asked us to. I love this article. These are just some examples of these things where you have, I don't know if any of you have read this one, but it's a really interesting one about, you have this community in Mexico. They've made their own community museum, nothing to do with colonialization or colonialism, colonialism. You know, they want to show their dead, but have gotten some backlash when they go to try and publish about the institution, because they want to show pictures of human remains, and these aren't being allowed in some of these journals. So it's a really interesting study. This is I'm sure some of you saw this, the big pharaohs parade in Egypt, when they were moving the pharaohs in these tank/chariots over across town to their new home, their new resting place. But you also have situations, so how we view the dead and deal with the dead. We also have situations where some institutions are destroying human remains because they don't have, well, financial ways to take care of them or space, but really sometimes just don't want to dealing with colonial narratives in the collection. This was a case in Sweden that was particularly unfortunate because a lot of our national organizations pleaded with them not to destroy the remains, but over 111 skeletal remains were destroyed in the end. And that's something that sadly is happening more and more because people maybe, I don't know, are afraid to have the human remains, don't know what to do with these people because they didn't have consent, they're on provenance, so they're making, one institution's recently made a burial ground and just put everybody in there. So it's a real issue in our field about what to do. Now, this is a bit blurry for a reason, but another thing that I deal with a lot are people talking about putting everything online, putting everything online. And this is when Twitter still existed, but this is a really important example because I get a lot of this all the time. Why is the Duckworth not online? Well, we actually are going to be online soon with certain collections of people, but a lot of communities have said no, absolutely not. So this was a reporter that actually went to the American Museum of Natural History's, got hold of their catalog of individuals and started posting online all of this information. Are your ancestors here? And just did this. And I watched this and I thought, oh boy, here we go. This is, you know, they think they're doing this righteous thing and they're going to spotlight what the museum isn't doing itself. And I just knew instantly that there was going to be so much backlash to this, and there was. And there were a lot of Indigenous scholars that I follow on social media that were absolutely like, what are you doing? Take it down. This is really inappropriate. If these people don't know yet about these remains, you're doing more harm. There was a lot of discussion. And this article came out, which is actually about something a little different, about this Penn Museum in the US, where they were using remains of 2 young girls that had been killed in these bombings, and they were using them for forensic online teaching. It's a little bit different, but Dr. Montero does actually talk about this issue with putting collections online. Now, obviously, it's helpful for when you're trying to do research to have collections online, and that's why we're trying to do that. But you do it isn't so black and white. Again, you need to think about, especially if you have collections of people that might, you know, have some sensitivities around where they've come from, their country of origin. descendant communities, it's very different depending on the community. So this is really interesting examples where you have people talking about this. There's a lot going on right now in the UK about whether or not we should even have collections like the Duckworth, whether or not we should be even retaining individuals or displaying the dead, doing research on them. Quite often this is debated there, you know, in the UK for a long time. It was pretty much, seems to be a general favor of seeing skeletons on display. There's not a real issue with that. But that I think is changing to some degree. But you have, so for example, this All Parliamentary Party Group for African Reparation has just done this Laying Ancestors to Rest, this huge report in March of 2025, where they've put out how they feel about this, and this picture with the Egyptian mummies came out of it as well with that. And they've laid out some you know, guidelines and some just suggestions of what institutions could do. And so there's a lot of people talking about this in different ways. A lot of the archaeology communities in Britain responded to that, saying, hang on a second, like, are we talking about African ancestral remains? Are we talking about British ancestral remains? Are we talking about human remains in general, global? What are we talking about? Because again, people engage with the dead differently and have for thousands of years. And so do we take that into account? I'm really summarizing it here. It's much more complex, and you can message me about it, but you can also go online. You know, there were some really good recommendations in that, but there's also a lot of other questions, and there needs to be more discussion. And I think, again, misinformation spreads really easily, but this is again, well, a tweet that was about the Duckworth, for example, about, you know, supposed willingness to return, but claiming not to know if they have them. I mean, that's not what happened at all. So how part of my job too now is trying to deal with press and putting out accurate information and making sure that communities understand that some of these people, you know, I don't know what they read. I don't know why they said that, but there's a lot of that we have to deal with, because human remains are really emotive and human remains are really powerful. And you're, again, talking about imbalances in power. And I was just saying, you know, I think about all the time, like, I wonder if what the dead would think about all these conversations we're having about them, or what we're doing. And, you know, would some of them be okay with it? Would some of them not? It's all a big what if. And I think it's important to talk about it. So this is, you know, but to be fair, I was like sick to my stomach for a week when I saw that tweet. I was like, what? That's not true. We hosted 5 people from Zimbabwe. They came, they saw the people, they did their own analysis. What are they talking about? But I've learned now to just let it, it's got to go away. Otherwise, I'm going to eat 100 tacos, and that's not good for my health. So, and I think in addition to that report, in addition to the response that a lot of the archaeological community put together, which I think was good. I love Heba Abd El Gawad. You probably have read about her or read her work. She's probably been here, I'm not sure, but she's amazing. And she did this really wonderful opinion piece on sort of pushing back a little bit, because she is Egyptian, and she's talking about, you know, you have this sort of African ancestral remains, no display, no research, none of that. But in Egypt, you know, she comes back with some really interesting stuff. And so what I take away mostly from her is the same thing that I think about a lot in our role as curators for the dead is, everybody's like, this all needs to happen, return, reburial. But no, unfortunately, no one's talking about how it's going to get paid for. And I hate to put those two things together, but it's the truth. Who takes responsibility? Who pays for it? How do let's say ancestral remains get back to the country that they originated from? Who supports the community, but also the institutions? And we have to be honest with this stuff. It's the truth, because it's thousands and thousands and thousands of pounds to ship anything to the other side of the world. So there's a lot of this kind of discussion about that. But also but what's missing in all of this is the middle part. Again, it's that middle part of care. Every day, what do we do? How do we look after the collections that are in our care? how do we get our archival materials? How do we pay for them? How do we actually make sure that access is, inclusive for everyone? Or how do we do scientific research that isn't going to damage the integrity of the collection forever? There's so much in between that a lot of the criticism never talks about. And I think that's where you come in, especially as early career researchers, because again, you are going to be you're in it. And if you want a future in this, these are the things that you have to think about. Getting clever with how you spend your budget, if you even have one. And so it's really hard. And I think she really touched on something in that article. I'm going to quickly finish up. Sorry, I know we're like, so axiology is something I talk to the students a lot about. It's another type of, it's kind of on par with ethics, but it's a little bit different. What I really like about it is reciprocity and benefit sharing, relational accountability. I'm a big fan of Remedios Vado, and I love this painting because I like that it's sort of forcing you to look at yourself and how you are every day when you come to your role, and how you deal with these things, and thinking about, again, like people say repatriation claim, and I like to say collaboration because that's what we're trying to do. I wrote 2 grants in 2 days. I don't know how I did it. I did not sleep. I looked insane when I came into work, but we managed to bring over 6 folks from Australia, Papua New Guinea, and Torres Strait, where we actually got to host them in Cambridge for a week. This was the launch of this project that we have now called Bringing the Ancestors Home. It's about Cambridge Collections, and this is the community. And at the end of it, they gave a 2-hour public talk, and it sold out. It was amazing. Speaking very honestly about how they felt about Cambridge and institutions, and especially Britain. I said, go for it. Don't hold back. It was amazing. We're trying to get more money now to do more of that, because I think it's bringing people here and actually talking to them instead of just sending an email and an email and an email is really important. Showing them the lab, showing them what we're able to do from a scientific point of view, from a conservation point of view, and then just with the design, with return at the end. It's amazing, and it worked really well. We've got amazing students. Like Nandar, who's just finished her PhD, and she, turns out the remains that we care for in the collection are from where her grandfather grew up and then experienced a genocide. So she's doing her project on, and how to take that further. So we try to host students. This is Catherine. I have permission from them, by the way, and I'm not trying to fetishize anyone. I'm just trying to show what we're trying to do in Cambridge, which is seek funding, work with students, support their applications to come to Cambridge. Catherine did her master's here, unbelievable person, and wrote this incredible master's thesis, which is under embargo at the moment, so she can discuss it more with Inuit people that in her community. She's Inuk. So talking about that, but really taking the university or the British system to task about, hey, this is what actually, from an indigenous perspective, how easy is it to find anything out about repatriation at Cambridge, and how easy or how hard is it, and why is a necklace in the British Museum and the body in the Duckworth? What the heck? What happened there? So she did a phenomenal project, and then her dad came and visited, and he worked at a polar bear station, so I got lots of stories about polar bears, and it was amazing. So trying to figure out these stories, right, about where the human remains are coming from. And I know this is flippant, this comment, but it's really powerful because it's true. We can identify farms, but when you start doing archival research, how do you go from a ceremony, a rite of passage, bringing her sister's skull through this rite of passage for puberty, and then how does that skull get into a Cambridge collection? What? Like, these are the kind of things that we're trying to uncover. So it's it's an uphill battle sometimes because people didn't always take good notes either. So I'm just going to quickly finish. These are the things that I talk a lot about with students, in particular, and my colleagues, thinking about, nobody wants to know more about the collections than us to a degree, as well as community members. We want to celebrate these collections. We want to fill our archives with all your wonderful research, and what you're doing, and your tradition of care recommendations. These are really important things, but I also think about the stuff that we do in the aftercare and the afterlife, publishing with people at all different levels, technicians, professors. Are you bringing community members to your lab? Are you paying local specialists in the country you're working? all of it sounds pretty like, yeah, of course we're doing that, but actually you'd be surprised at how much that still isn't necessarily happening. And if you are working on human remains, you know, what's going to happen at the end? Like, how far are you going to be able to go with it? So we want to make sure we're not patronizing people. We want to respect other people's specialisms and integrity themselves. You know, people say, oh, we can't return them, they don't have a museum. Well, then let's help them build one. Let's get some money to get some plastizote and some archival boxes and tissue and figure it out. You know, it's I know I'm idealistic, and I know I just really, I don't take no for an answer very well, but I do just want to try and think outside the box as much as possible when we talk about these collections, rather than shutting things down. No, we can't. Well, maybe we can, I suppose, but love you, Corey. Bye. Thank you. And I hope that made sense. I know I talked kind of fast. If you have any questions, I'm very happy to take them, but I'm going to end there, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much for that. I think it was really important and quite inspiring as well. So we've got some time for questions. We have one online, and then I'll move to in the room, if that's okay.
So CM has said, thank you so much for this talk. How do you view the intersection between your work and the modern death positive movement, especially the aspect of the movement that focuses on helping currently alive humans confront and have agency over their own funerary arrangements and death?
Well, what a question. That's, I mean, I think I consider myself a death worker, actually. Again, I am in a unique position, though. Again, I have done this, but I mean, I started as a teenager. Well, professionally 21 years old. I'm 51 now. So like it has actually been all I've ever done. So I do feel like I am a death worker in a lot of ways, because I do actually help. I take care of the ancient dead, and I actually help living people have those conversations as well. Anytime I do outreach, somebody inevitably asks me, what should I do with my body? What do you think about cremation? Or every time, not every single time. And I'm sitting there with like plastic skulls and smelly cubes to talk about the Iron Age, but they want to talk about these things because it's hard to talk about them. And that's where I think, like, they have death cafes for the death positive movement in museums, which I think is an awesome idea, because again, you are surrounded by, like I said, objects related to death, objects related to belief systems, afterlife, no afterlife, you know, religious teachings. So I think actually archaeology and anthropology intersect a lot with that. I mean, I kind of refer to that movement all the time, and I teach an online course on death, and it starts with Neanderthals and ends with, well, I'll use the G-rated version. It ends with like a funeral pyre, a little mini Viking funeral pyre for your cremated remains. So we go through everything in between because I think they all relate. There's a lot of strange things that you can put ashes into. So I think they very much relate, and I'd love it if we could do more stuff like that, actually, more projects together, because I think there is such a connection around, like I said, social inequality, right? Like, again, death poverty, that's happening massively today, and racism in death care. And that happened in the past as well. You can see it with mass graves, or, you know, genocide victims and you know, you see it actually in the bones too. So I think they both relate. Does that make sense? Cool.
Any questions in that?
I have a question. Can you guide us if there is a personal or private initiative from the public to repatriate some of the artifact or even the skull for that matter? Because I did visit the Cambridge Museum, and for your information, I'm from Borneo Island.
Ah, okay.
So I saw the collection, and
Yeah.
definitely I assume that some of Borneo collection of skull.
Yeah.
So if there is a personal or private, not from any institution, establishment, or even government official, as a state council myself, So is there any alternative or
So that's difficult, to be honest with you, because, well, there's many. So at Cambridge, for example, let's use Cambridge. The Duckworth or the museum don't decide on repatriation. Actually, it's the university registry, law division, and what's called a human remains advisory panel, which are people from different aspects of the university, like law and archaeology and stuff. So no one from these two institutions, so there's no bias necessarily. But they want to work with governments. They want to work with legitimate parties. So quite often too, whenever we have someone comment about a return, we have to do sort of a third party confirmation that this is the right organization to be talking to. It's because we have people from all over writing us saying that they're related to so and so, or they represent a community when in fact they don't. There's been some really tense situations with that where so I spent all summer, well, not all summer, but last summer I was in Australia traveling around meeting communities and hearing about how you've got some folks that are saying that they're the representatives and others saying they're not. It's really complex and you don't want to return anyone to the wrong place and to the wrong people. But that is just saying that out loud is like, but that's the truth. So like if there's a direct lineal descendant and you have proof of that, and I know how this sounds, but that's just the way that the legalities of it work too, to a degree. Then repatriation is quite straightforward. But if there's so like with the communities that I was speaking to, I've got the Australian government saying we want everyone back. We want everyone to country. And then the communities are like, hang on, we don't want our people going back to that white capital of Canberra. No. We want to do this ourselves. Problem is the government has the money and sometimes the communities don't, but we try to help with that, right? So that, now to be perfectly honest with you, where I'm kind of like, okay, so I'm telling the communities the government's done this, and this is all stuff I never had any. I did have American Indian law 2 semesters, but this is like nothing that I've ever had to deal with before. So it's really case by case, and I have had a lot of, we get people that, I'm sorry, but like a white savior complex where they're representing the Indians and they're taking money from the Indian. This is how they talk about it. And they have nothing to do with the situation, or someone feels spiritually inclined to another individual, but there's no kind of genetic direct link. So it's very complex. But usually the institutions want to work with other institutions, but that doesn't mean it's not possible. But it is hard. So, and I've got personal experience with that to a degree with some folks like in South America and other places. But does that kind of answer your question? But it's certainly something you can raise, and you can certainly contact the institution and say, you have feelings about this, and maybe try to set up a meeting. But it's complicated because there have been people who've abused that as well. So some people get quite nervous about it, to be perfectly honest. Is that kind of, yeah. But message me if you want to talk about, like, because we do care for people from Borneo in the Duckworth. So if you want to have a chat about it, we can do that too. Okay.
We've got one more online. No? Oh, okay. We've got time for one more question. Sorry, that's what.
It can be a doozy. Go for it. Like, hit me with something hard. Just kidding. Don't.
So a lot of what you're talking about is human remains that we have from abroad.
Yeah.
Do you ever get inquiries from UK communities about reburying? Okay.
All the time.
That's really interesting.
Yes, we do. We do, and quite often there's like a religious aspect involved in it. Obviously, too, in this country we have Honoring the Ancient Dead, which you're which is an organization of the Druid pagan community of the UK that feels very strongly about any human remains being used for research, that British remains should also be reburied and left to be in peace in the ground. So we get a lot of inquiries from them and other communities, one-off family members too. But nothing that we've ever, not that's ever gone anywhere. It seems to kind of just disappear after a while. You kind of contact people and then nothing. But yeah, so we get a lot of that as well. And now with the students, especially too, like there's a lot more discussion around whether we should have any human remains at all. But with the UK, we do get folks from different parishes asking. So try to have a chat with people rather than just an email discussion to see what they're talking about really. But it's also very complex. Again, it's so weird when you start talking about like the genetic turnover of the UK and everyone coming from Europe, but then you have people that feel very, pride in their origins and things. So it's really hard. But for us, it's mostly international. Once a year, twice a year, we probably get somebody. Actually, now that I really think about it, not all the time, but twice a year proper, and then quite regularly little inquiries. Yeah, so it's difficult, but we try to. Everyone's treated the same. Everyone's treated like everyone goes through the same process. So that's one way we try to deal with it in a fair way. I'm sure we'll have more. I know of one brewing. So.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
So can we have one final thanks for the speaker? I'd also like to thank our in-person and online audiences for coming along. And please join us next week for someone also from Cambridge and also talking about death. Taylor Peacock will be talking about thinking about sex, exploring overlap and difference in skeletal bodies from two geotemporal periods. And with that, please join us at the Clarendon to continue these conversations.
Thank you.